This is an administration that's not operating according to the law. They're not operating according to the Constitution. They're not operating according to past precedent, because what is unprecedented here is they're in the midst of a power grab.
Hello and welcome to the Trump Report with me, Louis Sykes. Today we're joined by Professor Scott Lucas, Professor of US Politics at University College Dublin's Clinton Institute, and also the founder and editor of EA Worldview. Scott, welcome.
It's great to be here, Louis. Thank you.
Well, as you can imagine, today we'll be talking about the protests and unrest that is continuing in LA. Alongside the National Guard, Trump has now deployed around 700 US Marines to the city. I mean, that's almost unprecedented in modern US politics, isn't it?
Yes, this is an unprecedented situation, Louis. Indeed, it was actually unprecedented before we get to the Marines. So let me walk this through, right? Because there's some Trumpists out there today who are saying, "Oh, this is all completely normal and not unusual," including on another UK channel. First of all, why is it unprecedented the way the National Guard were used? About 2,000 of them over the weekend. It has been 60 years since a U.S. president deployed the National Guard without the consent of the state governor. Now, why is it the state governor who's key here? Because the National Guard, despite the name national, operate under the states. They have a history going back to the 17th century as local militia. I'll leave that for the moment. But the fact here is look, if these were normal times, then you have, for example, the California state governor, Governor Newsom, saying, "I want to call them out." Now, Newsom didn't do so in this case. The last time that a federal government overruled a state was in 1965, when the National Guard were deployed on federal orders in Alabama, my native state. Now, why were they deployed in Alabama? They were deployed in Alabama to protect the marchers in Selma. These included Martin Luther King. They had been attacked on two previous marches that were disrupted effectively by white racists. And the state authorities refused to protect them, refused to intervene. So that's why the federal government stepped in. The Johnson government stepped in. So now, go 60 years later, and what you have is a federal government deploying the National Guard not to protect marchers or protesters, but possibly to confront them in what could become a violent situation. That's a huge difference. And just for the record, some of your folks out there might know that the case before 65, when the National Guard were deployed on federal orders, was in Little Rock, Arkansas. Why were they deployed then? The state government was not protecting the first Black American students going to schools under integration orders in Little Rock. So the National Guard had to assure the security of these kids.
In fact, Scott, if I could just interject that, I believe it not only were National Guard used there, but it was actually US paratroopers as well, the military itself.
Yeah, so the military went in at that point, and under the Eisenhower administration. So while they have deployed before, it has either been in cooperation with the state authorities. Let's say when you usually do the National Guard, if you have a hurricane, if you have the California wildfires that took place, if you have disastrous flooding, the National Guard come in as part of recovery efforts, right? If you have unrest in certain cities in which the local government or the state government says, "Look, we can't handle all of this, it's just too much," then the state government can call them in. The other case that's probably useful that we bring in before we get to the Marines on the National Guard is 1992 in Los Angeles. Now, that is the uprising unrest that follows the beating of Rodney King. And we're talking about weeks of property being burned, weeks of confrontation. But once again, even though this was unprecedented and that the Bush administration invoked the Insurrection Act, which is this act from 1798, little used act, it was done with the request of the California authorities, right? Now, on the Marines, let me tell you what I think the American media have not picked up on, which gets us to the wider game here. Because let's be clear, the Trump administration is not interested here in diffusing the situation. They're not interested in a goodwill effort to try to shut down the violence. Beyond trying to disappear migrants, which we can talk about, they actually are looking for further confrontation. Now, why do I say that? What the media seemed to have forgotten, and it just was at the back of my mind. I said, wait a minute. Trump has deployed the National Guard before. I know he's deployed the National Guard before. Wait, he deployed them in 2020 during the first term amidst the Black Lives Matter protest. He did it through they created this piece of legislation. I think they called it the PACT, which is like protecting American communities against terrorism or something like that. And they got National Guard units from 11 states and put them into Washington, D.C. So you remember they used the tear gas on the people in just across from the White House in the park across from there. And Trump goes charging through there and goes over to St. John's Church and waves a Bible upside down to prove he's a religious guy. That was all part of like invoking the military to come out. And they then used them in unmarked cars in Portland, in Oregon, again, to surveil and in some cases lift protesters. And they used them to a lesser extent in Seattle and in Kansas City. So they've used this type of force before, not to the extent that we're seeing in Los Angeles. And just to cut to the chase here, this is an administration that's not operating according to the law. They're not operating according to the Constitution. They're not operating according to past precedent, because what is unprecedented here is they're in the midst of a power grab. They're in the midst of a power grab that links two things. One is a specific. They want to be able to detain and disappear migrants and asylum seekers without obstruction. They don't want obstruction from the courts. They don't want obstruction from state authorities. They don't want obstruction from protesters. And I'll just refer you to one other incident on the other side of the U.S. Remember in New Jersey, I think it was Newark, where you had protest outside a federal detention facility in New Jersey. They arrested the mayor of Newark, Mayor Baraka, and just lifted him and threatened to arrest legislators that were there. In the case of Los Angeles, not only do we have all these deployments, they are preventing legislators from getting into the detention center, the Metropolitan Detention Center, or Municipal Detention Center, sorry, which is a federal facility where these people are held. So they're trying to lock this down. And again, it's important to note that in the buildup to this, the months of detentions that have taken place and disappearances, many migrants and asylum seekers, we don't even know their names. They simply have been rounded up and in some cases sent to places like El Salvador. So that's one part of what the Trump folks are doing. Don't get in our way over the deportations and the detentions. The second part of this is militarizing the U.S. system in support of their power, right? If we want to do something, we can use the military and to use it. I'm going to refer you now to another past incident, which is illustrative of this, which is when the National Guard were not deployed. And you'll know where I'm going about January the 6th, 2021, when despite the mayor of Washington, D.C., despite federal officials, including legislators like the Speaker of the House, Nancy Pelosi, including some members of the Republican Party who said, you have to get the National Guard here because people are attacking the Capitol building. Trump didn't do it. Now that's half the story. Why didn't Trump deploy the National Guard there? Well, it's pretty obvious he didn't deploy them because the guys who were attacking the Capitol were trying to keep him in power. Rewind it a few hours. He did try to deploy the military on January 6th, but he tried to deploy them in support of his attempt to stay in power. And that's according to the chairman of Joint Chiefs of Staff, Mark Milley, right? So he tried not only to get the National Guard out, but the U.S. military to try to overturn the 2020 election. Now here he is, he's in office, he's made it as president legally, and now he's going to use the military or try to in these different ways, because the idea is I can not only use them in LA, I can use them in any state, any city, on any pretext in terms of what's taking place. Whether this gets to the point where we have the confrontation being in LA and it escalates, I don't know. We can talk that through. But what I would say here is the Trump gamble here, and by the way, it's not just Trump who's behind this. We need to emphasize that there are advisors like Stephen Miller. And we need to emphasize that the difference between Trump 2.0 and Trump 1.0 is they're much more organized in what they're trying to do, is that they think they're on a win-win here. And that is, if the violence escalates, it justifies them calling out the military, right? If the violence does not escalate, then they say it didn't escalate because we deployed the military. And one other fun coincidence, question mark, I believe it's on June the 14th, which if I count my days correct, is about 4 days after we're speaking right now, when there's going to be a big old military parade in Washington, D.C., which is supposedly on the 250th anniversary of American forces, but it's also on the 79th birthday of Donald John Trump.
Behind all of this, as you've alluded to there, is this political brawl between Gavin Newsom and Trump himself. That's something of a set of long-term rivals. The latest is he's met Trump's threat and challenge to have him arrested by saying, "Go ahead, please do." How the hell do we get to that point? And would Trump really arrest the state governor?
Well, let's take it to where the serious context is around this story, which is for years, indeed going back to Trump 1.0, as part of this attempted power grab. The Trump administration has tried to take powers away from states. And because Gavin Newsom is a Democrat, because California is the largest state in the union, and because it can be stereotyped as those damn wacky liberals, they've been the target of this. So you go back to Trump 1.0 and with California's environmental standards, including the emissions legislations on automobiles, the Trump administration going in and say, no, you can't do that. The start of this term, when California is trying to deal with the devastating wildfires, the Trump administration is spreading all kinds of disinformation about how this is like some type of, almost like a plot by the California government to destroy its own state, and then say, well, therefore the federal government has to take over disaster management. Oh, and by the way, we have to take over your water supplies as well. So that there's a serious idea of trying to curb state power, not just California, but other states, which is on play here. Now, in terms of where it gets to in this specific case with Newsom, what happens is that the threat to actually arrest Newsom was made by Tom Homan, who is sometimes called the Homeland Security czar, the border security czar, right? And he's talking about immigrations and custom enforcement can't be impeded in their duties. So he issues a threat to any official, not just Newsom, but other officials, including the Los Angeles mayor, Karen Bass, says, you get in our way, we'll arrest you. Now, they have already made that threat for weeks in general about any city, any state where they're carrying out those raids. And I'm going to emphasize those immigration and custom enforcement raids may not be legal. They may not be constitutional. They are abusing human rights. They don't give a damn. Their only concern is they are able to do them. And so in that context, the threat against Newsom is quite logical, which is don't get in our way over this. And Newsom plays a bit of alpha male. And also, let's be honest, it helps his political reputation to stand up to Trump. And so we get into this. The really serious threat here is, so let's boil this down, is twofold. One is they're locking down these detention facilities where there's no due process of law. There's no hearings that are being conducted. You've got people who are scrambling right now in California saying that their relatives have disappeared. And they think they've disappeared in detention centers, but they're not sure, right? So you've got that immediate threat. You then have the wider threat, which is when people try to get some type of accountability here. And I refer to legislators and lawyers. They're not letting them into the facilities. And I'll just link this all back, Louis, because what I'm talking about is an authoritarian regime. And I'll just tell you the first time I used that word authoritarian regime, using immigration and asylum seekers as the platform of it, it was a couple months ago. And it was precisely because we were at a point when, you might remember, they had sent almost 300 people down to El Salvador to the maximum security facility there, which has, been accused of human rights violations left, right, and center. Now, the large majority of those people, we still don't know their names that went down there. And we do know, however, from those that we know, that the names that did get out, we know that most of them did not have criminal records. So this wasn't like they were taking the worst of the worst, which they're proclaiming. And the only reason why Kilmore Abrego Garcia, who is the man who was mistakenly deported to Maryland, the only reason why he found out about his cases is his family and his lawyer made enough noise that we found out what had happened. And in the past week, after months of stonewalling, they said, all right, well, he's coming back, but now we're going to bring him up on charges and try to throw him away in prison. We're talking about a systematic attempt, not just to disappear people, but to do it by getting rid of checks and balances. And checks and balances means courts, it means legislators, and it means state governments. And all you're seeing here is Los Angeles is playing out as the latest episode of this, but now with the added specter of how far will Trump go to bring the military in to this? And how far will the military allow itself? Which I can talk to you about in just a second, because I think this may be the most interesting part of the story that the media hasn't yet clocked.
Well, yeah, and I wanted to come on to that, but also a little bit more on Gavin Newsom. I mean, he's now filed to sue the government for deploying these troops. And I suppose the question in that is, was Trump within his legal or constitutional rights to do that? And, more so now with the Marines.
All right, absolutely. So let's break this down. National Guard. There are three ways you can deploy the National Guard. Now, one way that we got used to about 20 years ago is you deploy them overseas. Iraq, Afghanistan, that's clearly federal authority. You can do that because that's beyond state jurisdiction to do that. There's something which is called Title 32 authority, and that is when you have a state issue where you bring in you deploy the National Guard. And again, disasters is quite a common way of talking about doing that, right? Okay. The one that Trump has tried to use is called Title 10 authority. And Title 10 authority says that you can, in effect, go beyond the state authorities in deploying the National Guard if there's a threat of rebellion. Now, on Saturday, when Trump decided to deploy the National Guard, and I think very few people notice this, the Los Angeles law enforcement said that two people had been arrested on charges of assaulting police officers. One had thrown Molotov cocktails. The other had taken a motorcycle and driven it at some officers. I'm going to repeat, on Saturday night, when the protests were going on against illegal detentions, the number of people arrested for assaults on police officers were 2. That was it. That's a pretty damn small rebellion. Okay? There is another instance, just to make this complete, which is that the federal government can invoke Title 10 when the state government is disregarding the law or disregarding federal authority. And that was what we talked about, the 1965 case in Alabama, that they were disregarding the law and that they weren't protecting their own people. That's what Title 10 is. Now, I played at being a lawyer. In other words, I was supposed to be a lawyer before I got distracted and went into academia. My reading of it, and you can go to experts to back me up, is that he's really stretching Title 10 to try to deploy the National Guard. But let's talk about the Marines for just a minute, because the only way I can see legally you can deploy the Marines is if you're talking about that there's a threat of insurrection, right? Now, I'm going to repeat, 2 people assaulting police officers on Saturday night, the burning of a couple of cars that we have seen, does not constitute an insurrection. We're not talking 1861 to 1865, the Civil War, or January 6, 2021. We're not talking insurrection. We're talking about people who are protesting in a very small, very, very small number of those protesters turned violent. That is why, if you talk about, before we get to the legal case, that is why the Los Angeles mayor, the California governor, other legislators at state and federal level, and Los Angeles law enforcement have said, we don't need these deployments. We will handle this. The legal basis by which Newsom is filing the case, especially in terms of over whether you can deploy the Marines, I think is quite clear. And that is, you do not have the authority to do this because you don't have the grounds of an insurrection. Now, well, the thing is, and here's the kicker, it takes time to get those cases through the courts. And as we have seen with what the Trump administration has done with the multiple court cases against it, is they just keep playing it and playing it and playing it. They just keep appealing and appealing and appealing. So we could go for weeks or even months where they keep those troops there in LA while the legal process unwinds, even if they know that they're on very shaky ground to do this. Or they don't care.
And so if there is a level of doubt about what the Marines would actually be allowed to do in any case, if Trump can deploy them, which he seems to have done already, what is it exactly that they will actually be able to do in LA?
What I find interesting, Louis, is how the Pentagon is trying to handle this, because they're, on the one hand, they can't defy what Trump demands that they do. On the other hand, they don't want confrontation. In fact, they're very unsettled about it. So the Pentagon is trying to draw up rules of engagement, as it were, or rules of deployment, where these Marines would be around federal facilities. And indeed, the California authorities had sort of said, look, if the Marines are coming in, make sure they're just around federal facilities. Don't put them out throughout the city. So you're sort of having the adults in the room try to navigate this. The problem here is that the main detention facility in Los Angeles is a federal facility. So if the Marines are there, are you going to wind up having a confrontation? The trickiest point yesterday, Louis, so this would be on Monday, is when the National Guard were outside that detention center and they tried to disperse protesters so that they could get an armored convoy through, possibly vehicles that had detainees in them or that might be used to carry detainees. And at that point, it's like, wait a minute, is the National Guard going to use not only pepper spray and tear gas and rubber bullets? Is this going to escalate? We had other incidents where, in fact, protesters, including journalists, were shot yesterday with rubber bullets. Just play this out, that even with the Pentagon trying to limit this, if the Marines are using their normal service weapons and they have rubber bullets and you wind up getting people shot, then we're starting to get beyond the line of what already is a politically dangerous situation to one which can actually be an uncontrollable situation.
LA Mayor Karen Bass, who we mentioned briefly before, she says she believes LA is a sort of test case for federal intervention, her words. How much is all of this designed to send a message to other so-called sanctuary cities? Because, we are seeing other protests coming up in solidarity with LA. Is there an effort here is Trump going to be worried about sparking off a national movement, or would he rather have that kind of showdown with the sanctuary cities and sanctuary states, for that matter?
Is Trump worried about this? Hell no. I mean, come on. Let's go to past history here. This is a guy who, throughout his first term, called for political violence. Okay? He called for violence against people against his rallies. He called for violence against people who were picked up by police. He said, if there are migrants crossing the border and if they throw stones, you can shoot them in the legs. And he called for violence in 2020 when he said, liberate the state capitals, including those guys in Michigan who got into the state capitol and threatened legislators, and later on, some of those folks who wanted to kidnap the governor, Gretchen Whitmer. He's the guy who actually effectively said, stand up for the Proud Boys, the far right group who were involved in January the 6th. So is this guy opposed to violence and confrontation? Hell no. And he's not opposed to confrontation here because he thinks he can spin it. I mean, I agree with Karen Bass that Los Angeles is being used as a test case. I slightly disagree with her that it's a case of a test case of federal intervention. This is not intervention. This is an expansion of Donald Trump's personal power and the group around him, which constitutes, if it was in another country, authoritarian rule. That's what we're talking about. And if you're an authoritarian, you don't worry about violence, you use it. Do I mean that it's going to turn overnight into Iran or North Korea or Russia? No, but that's not the way that it would happen in a system like the United States, which has tried to work for 250 years to prevent authoritarian rule. You just sort of gradually ramp it up, and ramp it up by using extremist language at the same time, which says that anybody that opposes your authoritarian rule is the actual enemy.
Well, Scott, I mean, all of this is continuing as we speak, but and I'm sure we could talk more about it, but I'm afraid we are out of time there. But Scott Lucas, Professor of US Politics at University College Dublin's Clinton Institute, thank you very much for joining me today on the Trump Report.
Louis, stay safe and stay sane.